You know what? Whenever we work with My Save Work, we think about the Jersey of Courage. And, there was no real better reminder of how important that was than the stark reality and the reminder that we had a few weeks ago with the Humboldt crash. And I remember where I was during the time when I learned about that, and it was so devastating to think that all of those families and those friends and the loved ones are going to be dealing with that tragedy for the rest of their lives. My parents live in a small town about 2 hours east of Toronto. It's a town called Wellington. It's in Prince Edward County. Some of you may have been there. And before all of the wineries popped up and before the bachelorette parties became popular there, it was just a farming town. And they had really one major pastime, and that pastime was watching the Wellington Dukes, which is the junior A hockey team. And my parents are season ticket holders. They've actually billeted about 30 kids, 20 to 30 kids over the years in their community, sometimes 3 at a time. And they're not just fans, they're part of a community. So much so that they actually travel to away games all across Ontario in a bus, just like the one that crashed in Humboldt. It frightens me to think about the fact that it could have been them, it could have been my family that was part of that incredible tragedy. How many near misses do you think happened at that intersection over the years? How many data points could we have had to say that that intersection was dangerous? The tragedy wasn't an act of God. The probability that it was going to happen was quite low, of course, but not impossible. It was preventable. And we're all here today because we recognize that reducing workplace incidents is intentional. It doesn't happen passively, it's intentional. It requires more than regulatory frameworks and surprise inspections. It requires everyone in the organization to think safety, to talk safety, and to do safety every single day. But what does that mean, intentional? Well, last year we sponsored a study on employee participation in safety. And in it, we asked safety leaders about the perception of employee participation. 98% of them said that employee participation will actually improve workplace safety. 98%. I can't imagine 98% of people agreeing on anything. Yet all of these safety leaders recognized and understood that participation by the frontline workforce is going to improve safety outcomes. We're so intrigued by the stat that, being the safety nerds that we are, we decided we would actually analyze the correlation between participation in safety and injury rate reductions. We wanted to see whether or not all these leaders actually were right in their assumption. So we chose 40 randomly selected companies that use our software, and after a significant amount of regression testing and other analysis, we found that the companies with the highest levels of participation actually did have the greatest reduction in incident rates, by a factor of about 2. So it's not a coincidence. But why? Was it luck? How did they do it? How are they that much better than their peers? We needed to find out. So I, alongside one of our other senior members of our team, Calvin, where is he? Somewhere around here. There he is. We spent about 4 months conducting qualitative interviews of the companies in our study. We focused on their safety culture. We emphasized how it compares to the previous places that they've worked, how the culture has shifted over time, the drivers for cultural change, and what roadblocks they experienced along the way. So today, for the first time, we're going to reveal the results of our study. We welcome your feedback after breakfast this morning. If you'd like more details about it, certainly talk to us. We'd be happy to come by or host you in our offices to talk about the study. And actually, we're going to be releasing a lot more of it at our NXT conference in September in Arizona, so certainly encourage you to come to that as well. Now, we define employee participation along 2 axes. On the x-axis is the adoption rate. So how many of your employees, your frontline staff, are actually participating in safety? And on the y-axis, the activities per user. So not only are they participating, but how often? What's the velocity of participation that they have? And there's a distinction here. We focused on activities that actively mitigate risk, like leading a safety meeting, teaching other employees about safety, identifying hazards in the workforce, and completing corrective actions. Compare that to passive activities, which we omitted from the study, because these types of compulsory activities, well, for example, attending a toolbox talk, it's important, but ultimately it's less intentional than actively mitigating risk. Through our interviews, we were able to describe 4 distinct safety cultures based on the level of employee participation. It's a little bit small on the screen, so hopefully you can see. 3 of the safety cultures we would deem low participation safety cultures, and 1 safety culture, a high participation safety culture. On the bottom, we'll start with the low compliance culture. Here we have low adoption rates and low activities per user. Most often the business is probably in a low regulatory environment or low compliance environment, maybe a bank, retail environment, something like that. These companies do have safety activities that they do, but generally they're few and far between, and most of the employees are not really participating very often. Next, we have what we call an all-talk culture. These companies have high adoption rates, but very few activities per user, activities per person. In a lot of these cases, these businesses are reacting to a safety incident. The response is generally temporary. Maybe someone in the office tripped and the entire company now has to conduct a housekeeping exercise, which is great, but if they don't do it again, that's a reactive culture. And the reason why we call it all talk is because a lot of these companies have safety leaders or certainly executives that will talk about how great their safety culture is, but in the end, they're not actually doing a lot across the organization and activities, significant numbers of activities to back that up. On the top left, we have what we call a task force culture. These are companies that have relatively low adoption rates among their frontline employees, but the people that are doing safety are doing a lot of it. We see this in companies that have a very large safety team, and we call it a task force because that safety team is really the task force in the organization. Sometimes people refer to them as safety cops, and they're the ones handing out warnings and write-ups and things like that. And finally, we have the culture of participation. Here we have a high adoption rate and a high number of activities per person. Here, safety is every day and done by everyone. There's only one quadrant that correlated with the most significant amount of injury rate reductions, and that was the high participation culture. By definition, the companies that are in the other quadrants are unable to drive significant participation, but if they were able to, they'd see a drop in their incident rate by about 42%. So great. We've proven that employers with high participation rates actually have reduced incident rates. But the real question here is, how do they do it? Well, during our research, it became clear to us that safety culture is really a journey. You don't magically wake up one day and everyone in the company is actively and intentionally participating in safety. High participation safety cultures go through a series of intentional steps in a particular order to get where they want to be, which I'll describe momentarily. But to understand the difference between a high participation safety culture and a weak safety culture or a poor safety culture, we must first describe what a poor safety culture looks like. Everyone will tell you it's about reinforcement of unsafe behaviors, like the operations manager who postpones preventative maintenance in order to hit quarterly targets. But we did find one other characteristic that describes a poor safety culture. The characteristics it's easier to understand in retrospect, so consider the following example. Take a look at the picture on the screen there. What reaction do you have? Is it shock? Is it disgust? Do you cringe when you look at it? I mean, how can this woman let her baby lie down in the front seat while she's driving the car? Our perception of risk evolves over time, where once acceptable activities are now clearly unacceptable. What routine behaviors do you accept today that will be considered unacceptable tomorrow? A poor safety culture is blind to the many indicators of risk around them and never considers this question. And again, I ask, what routine behaviors do you accept today that will be unacceptable tomorrow? A high participation safety culture doesn't rely on 1 or 2 safety leaders to identify and mitigate every risk in the company. On the contrary, all employees in a high participation safety culture are keenly aware of the unacceptable behaviors and the lack of controls. In a high participation safety culture, all employees are on the safety team. Let's get back to the safety culture journey. Through our study, we identified a pattern of 5 key success factors in a particular order that were used to build a high participation safety culture. Step 1, CEO commitment. Every single company with a high participation safety culture had a committed CEO, a CEO that their safety leader admired for their commitment to safety. They didn't just feel comfortable or happy that their CEO was committed, they actually admired the commitment level that the CEO had. This is the most important step in the process, and without CEO commitment, it's impossible to create a high participation safety culture. I'm not the first person to stand on a podium and say that the CEO needs to be committed. But if it were that easy, every CEO would genuinely carve out time for their employees to spend doing safety activities. They tell their board of directors that safety outcomes is a strategic priority for the company, and therefore intentionally choose to invest time and money in the initiative. Now, all too often, we come across CEOs who still promote safety, but when it comes down to it, they choose production over safety. It's not a secret. Their leaders know it, their employees know it, and their safety leaders absolutely know it. And it's the reason why their company will never become a high participation safety culture. But many CEOs are genuinely committed. So how did they get there? What's the difference between a committed CEO and a CEO that's not very committed? What happened to get their attention? Consistently, what we heard during the interviews is that a catalyst occurs to awaken the CEO to the dangers that surround his or her employees. There were only 2 types of catalysts that were discussed by the subjects of our study. The first catalyst is a serious workplace incident that happens either inside their company, to one of their peer companies, one of their friends, or one of their family members. When the impact of the tragedy is felt personally, the CEO experiences a new sense of urgency to control the risks of their employees. The second type of catalyst is economic. This happens when the CEO awakens to the fact that a poor safety record will hurt their bottom line, or that a great safety record will help them achieve more income. Take the certificate of recognition, for example. When CORE first came to Ontario, a number of CEOs just shrugged it off as being a new regulation. They would delegate it to a low-level employee, an administrative assistant, or something like that. But once they found out that without their certificate of recognition, they'd be excluded from bids, CEOs took notice, and a lot more happened with the certificate of recognition. Once the catalyst happens, the forces upholding the status quo are suspended. So the CEO is excited to demonstrate that first key initiative, which leads us to step number 2, the rise of the safety leader. Across all of our interviews, we found that the promotion of the safety leader to the strategy table alongside sales, operations, and finance was a key success factor. Giving the safety leader credibility and the power in the organization is crucial for change management, which is what we'll see in steps 3 to 5. The safety leader's authority is derived not by being given a large budget or by being given a large safety team, but from the public recognition by the CEO, who stands up and demonstrates an authentic and strategic personal commitment to the organization. There's a story about one of our customers, Alcoa, an American aluminum company, that demonstrates this point. In the early 90s, Paul O'Neill became their CEO. At his first investor meeting, Wall Street was excited to hear about all the changes he was going to make to improve the stock price. But instead of talking about that, instead of talking about margins and revenue growth, he talked about safety. It was the only thing that he wanted to talk about. Not surprisingly, Wall Street didn't really like this, and they called him crazy and said that he was going to sink the 100-year-old company. He wanted to build a company where nobody got hurt on the job. You see, Paul O'Neill didn't just slap a website on or a web page on his site. He didn't just put money into safety. He made safety a #1 priority. He made an authentic, personal commitment to safety. He actually sacrificed his own reputation in the short term. Publicly, internally, he created a great reputation for himself. And that leads us to step number 3, which is getting employee buy-in. With leadership aligned and resources committed, the organization is now ready to convince employees of the new safety norms. It requires you to create awareness, and in the best circumstances, you're actually creating a tribe of safety believers. As we all know, though, it's easier said than done. For certain employees, you're attempting to change their belief system, and that takes energy, time, and commitment. I'm going to speak about this topic for a few minutes because it's incredibly important and one of the most challenging to actually get executed. We found this to be the place where most low participation safety cultures get stuck in the safety culture journey. Habits are hard to break, especially when they span generations and traditions. The desire to fit in and be accepted by your peers can become an obstacle to a strong safety culture, especially among young, impressionable employees working alongside older employees who may have poor safety practices. Therefore, our first objective is to get buy-in from the older generation of workers. We found that the most successful communication strategies recognize that older workers are generally motivated to do a good job, to provide for their families, by doing hard work and remaining loyal to their company. The strongest safety leaders, however, go further by connecting the job safety to job security. A provider is motivated to secure their income and eventually their retirement. This insight creates communication for us as follows. A strong safety record is fundamental to our success as a company. It helps us to win contracts, reduce costs, and increase profitability. Therefore, doing safety has a positive impact on the bottom line and creates job security for everyone. Don't be afraid to talk about the economics of safety. Yes, safety is altruistic, but it's also economic, and the best safety leaders don't shy away from this reality. With older workers on site, our attention shifts to onboarding and training the younger workforce. Since younger workers have fewer habits to break, and since their tenure doesn't give them a false sense of job security, a strong onboarding strategy that puts the safe worker on a pedestal is enough to convince them to work safely. However, just getting buy-in is not enough. We identified 2 tactics that reinforce these new beliefs: a branded safety initiative and a visible safety symbol. A branded safety initiative can be as simple as a well-thought-out slogan and a logo as a constant reminder. One of our companies in the study, Roseburg Forest Products, which has about 5,000 employees across Canada and the United States, created a program called Zero to the Core to reinforce their belief that they can achieve zero incidents. They put their logo on everything. They repeat Zero to the Core every time they have a platform to do it. Every time they make an announcement to the company, they're always repeating it. They host barbecues to show the solidarity of Zero to the Core. And eventually it becomes an important part of their vocabulary. Tip of the tongue, top of the mind for their employees. The second tactic is a visible symbol that demonstrates the CEO's commitment. For example, one of the companies in our study was initiating a back-in parking program. They recognized that backing in is safer than driving directly into a parking spot. The CEO's truck was closest to the door, and the CEO arrived in the morning before everybody else did. It was a constant reminder of the CEO's commitment to safety. The truck was a symbol that the most influential person in the organization had made a commitment to safety, challenging everybody else to do it. And in fact, I was there at the company, and I drove into the parking lot, and I drove directly in, and then I looked around me, and everybody else was backed in. And of course, I'm going to have to conform to that environment, so I backed in as well. And that's what happens in these types of environments. Step number 4, demonstrating responsiveness. With change management taking effect now, it's time to revisit how you're actively mitigating risk in the organization. You may be conducting field-level hazard assessments, hazard IDs, vehicle inspections, a whole bunch of plethora of activities that you could be doing. You spend so much time on change management now, there's only one thing that can spoil your fun and take you back to step 1, a lack of responsiveness from employee suggestions. At this point, employees are looking for consistency and need responsive leadership. For example, if an employee identifies and reports a hazard, it's imperative that the corrective action be acknowledged immediately, resolved in a short period of time, and that the employee is updated and ideally celebrated for their efforts. If the employee walks by the hazard every day without it being fixed, imagine what it does to their confidence in leadership. The employee and any of the other employees that person talks to about their frustration with leadership will revert back to the old ways, and you'll lose all of the progress that you've made. We interviewed a company that had gone through steps 1 to 3 really well before adopting eCompliance, but when they got to step 4, they were unprepared to manage the increased workload. Hazards were being identified faster than administrators could deal with them, and paperwork piled up. Suddenly, the hazard reporting stopped, and it didn't come back for a really long time. Pilot one initiative in one location and focus your efforts on responsive execution. Managers require discipline to prioritize safety and time to adjust to the new responsibilities. Coordination between people and departments and functions need to evolve to triage the risk, prioritize actions, and communicate to the frontline staff. Quick response time is essential before you scale your operation. And that takes us to step number 5, scaling your daily safety activities. With systems and process in place, it's time to drive for participation. The goal is to have all employees do safety every day. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It can take years, so you can't rush it. There are many strategies for increasing adoption rates and activities over time. Some companies roll out geographically, some companies roll out by job profile, some by risk profile. As the program scales, so does the demand on leadership, system, and processes. Step 5 is about empowering your workforce to identify and submit hazards as often as they can. You're no longer creating a high participation safety culture, you're now maintaining it. So let's think about how you got here. You need to successfully transition through all 5 stages that we've gone over today. You can't skip any. You have to be careful because you can still unwind all the work that you've done. If your CEO goes on site without PPE, your work will be unwound. If you have a vocal supervisor telling everybody in the company that safety activities are a waste of their time, your work will be unwound. And if you don't respond to worker suggestions in a timely manner, your work will be unwound. All of this change doesn't happen overnight. Nothing this big or this important ever does. This is why we say safety is intentional. It's systematic. You need real buy-in and real action from every level of your company. It's more than just organizational change. It's cultural change. There's no cutting corners or skipping steps on your cultural journey. A high participation safety culture leads to fewer incidents and improved financial performance. Getting into the top right quadrant can be done by any company as long as you have a committed CEO, a great safety leader, you are able to get buy-in from your workforce, you respond to employee suggestions, and you create a lot of safety activities within the organization. High participation safety cultures stand out amongst their peers and are leading the way towards a safer future. I'm going to leave you with one question. When your kids or your grandkids are old enough to take that first job, and they're excited about that company that they're going to work for, it's the first time they're going to be in the workforce, what kind of culture do you want them operating in? Thank you.